too late in the day. Can't do it. I was actually wondering if we could do a quick blast with the doors open. It's really sticky in here. Would that be all right for everyone? I understand there's sort of a trade-off between volume of noise from the street and fresh air, so we might just have to find the right balance point. So normally, when I do talks, I'm usually the one that kind of runs around the stage waving my arms around. And the sort of the relentless sort of optimist and utopist. But I don't know about you, it's been a really fucking weird summer. And I was sort of sitting there this morning with my usual kind of open culture is good and my usual kind of rah-rah speech, and I just kind of found that I couldn't quite find it within me to do it. And then I had lunch with the very clever Kim Plowright, who's sitting in the middle there, who kind of joined me in this sort of general sense of malaise, this kind of, I don't know, I mean, it was a strange summer for reasons that the sun came out. I mean, and you know, and I am never one to want that sun to go away, but I think the sort of soporific ecstasy, if you like, that we sort of seem to have found ourselves in the UK and particularly in London, has been in really sharp contrast to what's been going on around us and of interest, I suspect, particularly to this group. And of course, I'm sort of talking about that peculiar moment that we had a few times over the summer where it felt to me like the fourth wall had been breached. It really felt like a character out of Cory Doctorow's novels was kind of looking straight at me down the camera and going, sucked in. You thought it was only in Cory's head. Turns out, no, turns out that actually we were being watched. Turns out everything we do has been broadcast, even as we weren't aware of it. And I think this is sort of set up this kind of feeling within me that I think, frankly, Tobias has articulated much better than I ever could, which was this sort of sense of kind of helplessness, this sort of sense of, what do I do in the face of this? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, actually, if that's all right with you guys. And I sort of hope that with the lights up, I can sort of see your faces. So I'm hoping that you are going to interact in this conversation as well. So it's sort of also been a weird summer for me because in August, on the 27th, it was exactly 10 years ago since the BBC announced a project called the Creative Archive. And who remembers the Creative Archive? Does anyone sort of remember? Wow, okay. I guess this is a well-qualified audience, actually. Sorry, I should. And for those of you that don't know about the Creative Archive, it was the BBC standing up and making a statement that frankly is still radical to this day, that they were going to open up their audio and visual archive. Just to put that into context for you, think 1 million hours of moving image material is the estimate of what they think is in the archive. And 10 years ago, even at that point, they couldn't tell me how many hours of audio material they had. No one could actually tell me. So we're talking about a fairly, significant collection. And they were talking about digitising that, putting it on the web, letting you download it, and here was the kicker, allowing you to take that material and reuse it for your own creative expression. And I have to say, for me, as that, ever optimistic utopian, this was like the best bloody thing ever. And so it was my great good fortune that I became the co-program director of that with a fantastic guy called Paul Gerhardt. And, we had 3 glorious years where we actually thought it was going to happen. Like, we really did. And I look back now with sort of, a sort of embarrassed shrug for that me of 10 years ago, because we really did. We really actually thought that we were going to crack it, that not maybe the whole 1 million hours, but, I would have been happy with 100,000 hours. Like, I would have thought, yeah, that would have been good. In fact, I think in the end, we managed to get something like 10 hours. And as you all know, by its very absence, it clearly didn't happen. And so I think that's also sort of kind of participated in this general sense of what is this future and how do we improve it when it feels like the very roots of enfranchisement, the very roots of how it is we participate in decision making in our society is really at question, or it certainly is for me. I don't know about you. But I sort of feel like, I marched against Iraq. We didn't even get a march on Syria. They might have taken the right decision, but I have absolutely no sense that decision was taken with me or my views in mind. I don't know. I have no idea. I simply don't feel agency in these big decisions. And so I'm sort of really curious about how do we really think about the technology substrate that we have, and how do we think about what agency we can and should have on that substrate? I don't know the answer, I wish I did. But an idea that I've been playing around with, and frankly it's inchoate, so I apologise, but that I wanted to share with you today is the more and more that I sort of join up the pieces of my practice, to the extent that I have a practice, I'm still incredibly uncomfortable using that word in relationship to myself, but to the extent that I sort of join it all together, what I've realised is it all comes back down to really enabling people to tell their own story, and the story of their communities, and the story of the people around them that are important, but frankly, their own stories. And I'm just going to do a little sort of caveat here. One of the things that I often get, which is very flattering, but incredibly untrue, is people always come up to me and say, "You're incredibly altruistic. Like, the stuff that you do is all about helping other people." And I just want to be very clear here, that's absolute bullshit. The reason I do a lot of the stuff that I do is because I want to tell my story. And it really comes from that 16-year-old self in Australia, in country Australia, even better. I think Honor is probably the only one that would really understand what that means. I was a redhead. I did not tan. I wasn't interested in surfing, and I to this day do not like beer. So you can kind of imagine the kind of cultural dissonance that really was my context as a 16-year-old. And frankly, the stories that were being told about me and the people around me just didn't resonate with me. They weren't my story. And I didn't feel as if I had the means to be able to tell that story. And it's that 16-year-old self that drives so much of what I now do. I'm really profoundly interested in having the platforms and having the materials to tell my own story. End of caveat. So we come back to sort of joining up these pieces and really thinking about what is it about storytelling, what is it about telling our own stories that I think makes a difference. And here's what I think it comes down to. We this morning heard, I think, a really interesting and very important conversation about seamlessness and the importance of sort of being able to see those seams or not, and the sort of the seductiveness, if you like, of that sort of seamless experience. And here's the thing I want to suggest, is that so much of the way that we think we have voice, traditionally have voice, actually kind of creates a homogeneity. We remove those seams almost. So even when we march on Parliament, it's too easy for everyone to see a homogeneity there. It's just a thing. There isn't that sense of being able to kind of pull it apart into the plurality of voices that actually are marching on Parliament, and every single one brings with them a nuance, brings with them a perspective that is incredibly important. And, you know, I studied journalism for better or worse, and it was always this thing which we know oh so well, which is, you know, one person dies next door. It's way more important than 10 million dying in a country the other side of the world. And I think this applies when we start to think about that homogeneity. We, I think, need to think about how do we engage in a democratic process where we use the technology that we have, an unprecedented ability to tell stories to the world. They might not listen, let's face it. You know, we write tweets, we make blogs, we might only have a small community that engages with it, but we have the potential for all of our individual stories to now find a place on a world stage. And increasingly, I'm having to kind of radically reapproach my, I guess, anybody here know Myers-Briggs? I absolutely loathe it, but yeah, right. So I'm about as far as you can get on the I spectrum. I'm an incredibly learned E. For those of you who don't understand what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But essentially what I'm saying to decode is I sit on a kind of introverted end of the spectrum. I have fantastic learned ability. I can see someone else is nodding up there as well, which means I can take a stage and not freak out. But it's like when I'm done, I will go sit in a corner and quietly rock, and I will feel better, and it will all be good. But I'm having to radically rethink my own comfort, because I actually don't publish my stories. I don't tell my stories. I can't quite see, Faris down here. I don't publish out information about myself. I keep it very, very close. And I'm very careful about the stories that get told about me. And I'm having to radically rethink this in the context of democratic engagement, or what I'm increasingly thinking of democratic engagement. How do I make decision and policy makers see me as their neighbour, not as one of the 10 million in a country far, far away? And I think this is where, a lot of the work that I have done, and I will wrap up soon because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A, really, I think, starts to make sense to me. And so, a lot of the work that I have done is about providing platforms for people to tell stories. So Bus Stops was a completely bonkers and wonderful, wonderful project from my perspective, where we put giant LED screens on the top of bus shelters all across London. You could only see them from the top deck of a red bus. And there was sort of these just delightful moments where commuters are sitting on buses and they pull up to a bus shelter, and there's an animation, sometimes rude, which I loved, sometimes just fun, sometimes just whimsy, sometimes just stupid. But the whole point was that it was public art, in the sense that the public was making art. And the public had a mechanism by which they could tell their stories in really quite succinct but very powerful ways. The Creative Archive was really an attempt, and indeed all the work that I've gone on to do at the BFI and with archives around the world, I really strongly believe that the storytelling that I'm relating to and the enfranchisement that I think comes from that storytelling is also critically underpinned by our ability to reappropriate mainstream stories that are told about us as part of our cultural heritage. So I really want to get access to those stories that were told in the media in the 1970s about 16-year-old girls. I want to get hold of Puberty Blues. I want to get hold of those movies that were really important to me at that time, and I want to reappropriate that in order to be able to tell the story of my own cultural heritage, rather than, again, having to constantly reintroduce myself, kind of recontextualize myself over and over again, so that I'm actually differentiated from those cliches, from those stories that were told as I was growing up. And so really, for me, it's so important that, in fact, we do end up getting access to that million hours, because the BBC did tell our story and have told our stories here in the UK for years and years and years. And the example for me that is, I think, the one that kind of really sums it up for me is, of course, the BBC was the main news outlet and was the primary news storyteller for the Notting Hill riots. And the Notting Hill riots are such an incredibly important moment in London history, and in terms of the sort of cultural landscape of London. And 10 years ago, one of the things that I used to use an example is, wouldn't it be amazing if the people of Notting Hill could actually access that material and reappropriate it to tell their story, the actual story. As you can imagine, that coverage was not always very balanced, and it was not always very, balanced is probably the best way to describe it. And then earlier this year, it was my great privilege to see a film made by John Akomfra John is an amazing filmmaker. He works a great deal with archival footage, and he used material from the Notting Hill riots in one of his films, and it was such a completely different interpretation and a completely different appropriation of that material. And I want us all to be able to do that. I want us all to have that capacity. So in summary, this is sort of a bit of a ramble, and I apologise, and I sort of intentionally asked to sort of sit down here to signal, I guess, that I wasn't going to do a kind of rah-rah speech, and that I wasn't going to do a sort of a slick presentation, but that I really wanted to kick off a discussion, not just today, but more broadly, about how do we refine enfranchisement in this technology future that we are living in? How do we make the most of this capacity for each of us to tell our story, and in telling our story to actually make a difference? What is it that we can do to really make that work? Even as at the same time our kind of political dimension and political agency feels like it's getting even further and further away, and that the choices we have are not really choices at all. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.